Well, I'm glad to see you all back. On May 15th, 1776, John Adams proposed that each provincial Congress be authorized to abolish the existing government where no satisfactory government exists. Pennsylvania was the most obvious target for this particular move, and that's because in several other colonies that had already happened, either because the royal governor left town and the Congress took over, or because the assembly continued, but it was continuing without being part of a royal government, or in Maryland's case, a proprietary government. Let's look at the next one. Yeah, South Carolina had already acted. On March 26, 1776, the Provincial Congress of South Carolina dissolved the Assembly. The Assembly were anxious to go out of business, but the Congress decided, or the convention decided, I guess they were calling themselves a Congress at that time, decided it was time for them to go. And the very same day that the assembly was closed, the members of the Congress were sworn in as the new assembly, and they set about adopting a constitution. One of the curious things about the South Carolina Constitution was that it abolished the title governor. So they had a president in the case of the first man there on the left, William Henry Lawrence, and a vice president who was why am I can't quite read it, and I'm sticking on his name, Henry Lawrence. Did I mix those two up? I can't see to read the caption. It was William Henry Drayton. He was the president, and Henry Lawrence was the vice president. Henry Lawrence, incidentally, is a very interesting character. He was a planter and a merchant in Charleston and made an awful lot of money in the slave trade. He was a very big slave trade merchant. And yet, by 1776, he had turned against the slave trade. It's an evil thing that I was involved in. And he wanted it abolished. And a year or two later, he wanted African Americans, slaves, freed in order to serve in the Continental Army on the same basis as white soldiers. So he was a man who had a lot of growth in his own time there. So now let's look at Pennsylvania. Next, yes. The Pennsylvania Assembly had a majority of moderates, and we'll see why, not eager for independence. So these moderates, really, you have to see them as a spectrum, that there were strong people for independence, but yeah, just not now. Am I holding this wrong? No. Okay. Let's get some foreign aid. Let's get recognized. Let's be better organized. All the way to people who were loyalists. And in any case, John Dickinson, representing Bucks County, remember Bucks County, expressed their views. That's a very nice picture of John Dickinson, too. A very good man. Okay, next. Now, Why was this true? Why was Pennsylvania so heavily anti-independence? It's because from earlier times, the assembly was weighted in favor of the three counties, Bucks, Philadelphia, and Chester. And the city of Philadelphia was taken out of Philadelphia County, so it's a separate entity. So Bucks, Philadelphia, and Chester on the Delaware River, they had 24 members in a legislature of 41 members. So those three counties had a majority automatically. Most Quaker and Mennonite pacifists lived here, as well as others inclined to go slow. I mean, there were all sorts of other people, Swedish Lutherans and Anglicans, Presbyterians. They were not all coming from a religious pacifist viewpoint. They were just saying, you know, maybe independence later, or independence, no, let's renegotiate with Britain. But those three counties have a majority. Now, what's the next one? The city of Philadelphia is a hotbed of revolution. It had two members, Ben Franklin and Thomas Mifflin. And that is a portrait by Copley of Thomas Mifflin and his wife. We hardly ever get to see the women in these cases, but here he's sitting at a table there and his wife is in the front. It's a very nice portrait. He became a major general in the Continental Army and was was already a member of the what do we call it? The Continental Congress. All right, now the next one, and I'm going to expand quite a bit on this. The remaining 8 counties had only 15 members, a minority for all of them. Nearly all of Pennsylvania's Scotch-Irish Presbyterians and German Lutheran and Reformed people lived there. From the 1760s, well, let me just talk this one then. All right. From the 1760s, there is a kind of ethnic religious pull to Pennsylvania politics. In 1764, the March of the Paxton Boys, as it was termed, on Philadelphia, brought a series of demands. First of all, because the nature of Pennsylvania in 1763, we've just ended the war, Pontiac's Rebellion is going on. There was a battle out by Bushy Creek by Pittsburgh. So the war is very definitely going on in Pennsylvania. And the objection, especially of the Scotch-Irish Presbyterian body, which was quite large, was that you Quakers have about as much likelihood of having Indians come in and burn your house and kill your family as if you lived in London. Whereas we are the ones who suffer from Indian outrages. There's a famous cartoon that was part of that 1764 campaign that shows the Quakers are driving the Indians are being carried by the Scotch-Irish who are enslaved, as it were. So that was one objection. It was compounded by the fact that from the very beginning of that French and Indian War, Quakers and Mennonites had combined in what was called the Friendly Association for Restoring Peace with the Indians. And they were making treaties with various Indians. And when you gave an Indian treaty, you had to bring a lot of presents. Now, many of those presents were innocent sort of things like blankets and iron pots and whatnot, hats. But the Scotch-Irish were concerned very deeply that with all of these treaties, they were giving guns and ammunition, purely for hunting purposes, all right, to the Indians who were then going to come and kill them. So this was a very bitter fight. And it was leading more and more through the 1760s to a drive to oust the Quakers and the Mennonites from any kind of political power. And it continues then into the Revolutionary years. So let's go to the next one. Whoa. On June 14th, 1776, the elected Pennsylvania Assembly was dissolved, and the convention took its place. They set about writing a constitution. Ben Franklin was the principal author. It made some interesting changes. Instead of having an assembly with two houses, the assembly and the council, it had just one legislative body. It replaced the governor with a multiple executive council. And it required, I'm sorry, I can't even read my writing there. It abolished property qualifications. So yes, everybody, as long as you paid taxes, you could vote. But the hook on this whole thing was, remember now, the assembly that replaced the elected assembly was unelected. The members of the convention or the provincial congress were elected by voters in each county, so in a sense they were also elected. But in order to approve the Constitution, which would be the first time anyone in Pennsylvania would have an opportunity to express an opinion about it. This is done in the fall of 1776, after independence. You had to take an oath, and it was an oath to defend the state with force of arms. And consequently, any sincere Quaker or Mennonite would say, I can't do that. That goes against my faith. So effectively, what they did in 1776 was to disenfranchise the Quakers and the Mennonites, and that continued for a very long time into the Republic. So it was a resounding victory primarily for the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians who had been pushing this. And as a token of their victory, the state capital of the new state of Pennsylvania moved from Philadelphia, bad place, full of Quakers and other such folk, and went to Harrisburg, because Harrisburg on the Susquehanna was right in the middle of a Scotch-Irish settlement. And it was also, there were a lot of Germans in that part. And I should say, just for the sake of accuracy, that Lancaster County, on the southern border, but still on the east side of Susquehanna, did have some substantial Mennonite and other German pacifist and Quaker residents. But just to make sure that we have a clear view of all that. All right, now, what happens next? All right. New York had a similar pattern. The assembly dissolved and was replaced by the convention. Interestingly, when they met in May 1776, and it was still the convention at that point, the convention, they were forming a new state government. And that was taking up their time. So in the next month or so, the new state government, dominated by the convention, will be in charge. But it's the convention, the outspoken Patriots, who instructed their delegates in Congress to oppose independence. And this is crucial for the next stage, because the New York delegates, who included people who wanted ultimately to vote for independence, could not go against the instructions they had from their state. So while they were writing a new constitution for New York, the delegates in the Continental Congress were still bound to that original order from the convention, which is now the state assembly. So, is there another one of these? Or is that the end? Oh, okay. Yeah. Good. So, the three recalcitrant states had, in the course of the spring of 1776, been brought to heel. South Carolina would still have people voting, as we saw Edward Rutledge leading his South Carolina delegation to oppose independence in June, and New York opposing independence when it came up in June after Richard Henry Lee's resolution. And the third opponent, Pennsylvania, of course. And down to the wire on July 2nd, John Dickinson was arguing vehemently against independence. But when the final vote was taken, he abstained, and Pennsylvania and South Carolina would ultimately vote for independence. Well, we wanted to leave time for our friend John Adams. So let's clue in John Adams. He's going to talk a bit about himself and about other events, but he's going to take us up to a very crucial moment, which is where we'll take up next week.
Good day to you. My name is John Adams. I have been asked to say a few words about myself. Although as a New Englander, that is no small task. Perhaps I should begin by saying that I am the Mr. Adams you do not mistake for being a master brewer. But in truth, I am the 5th generation of New England Adams. We were farmers all, freeholders as well, beholden to no one for our property but ourselves. My father desired that I should have a good education. I attended and graduated from Harvard. Education was so important to my father that he did one thing that was unheard of for a freeholder. He sold a parcel of that valuable property to pay for my education. My father also desired that I should enter into the clergy. I myself desired that I should stay as a farmer. Instead, I suppose we entered into a compromise. I became a school teacher, and a very unsuccessful one as well. And then I proceeded to enter into the law, where I began an illustrious career by losing my first case because I improperly filed the paperwork. But I did improve, and eventually I had a fair career, despite some of my more questionable clients. But because of my efforts and my reputation, the good people of Massachusetts determined to see me consent to my ruin by offering me a position in the Massachusetts legislature. And then, for my efforts there, I was further consented to ruin by representing Massachusetts in the first ever Continental Congress. We gathered in Philadelphia in this Congress in response to the taxation and subjugation of the British Army and Parliament, in Boston, of course, but as a colleague in the Congress stated, the actions of the British Army and Parliament upon the Massachusetts Bay Colony affect the entire continent of America. Our first gathering of the Congress, in my opinion, accomplished very little, but we were able to create an address of our grievances, as well as a humble petition to our king for reconciliation. And we sent both to the king and to Parliament and to our respective colonies' government, and we awaited a response. Unfortunately, we received the most terrible of responses on April of 1775, when the Massachusetts militia was attacked by the British Army as the militia was withdrawing to avoid a skirmish. And the towns of Lexington and Concord saw the death of many militiamen at the hands of our so-called British brothers, which made it clear that there was a need for a second Continental Congress. The subject of independence came into greater contemplation for the following year, due to actions such as George III's declaration of all 13 colonies, not simply New England, being in open rebellion against England. There were the treacherous naval attacks due to Parliament's passage of the American Prohibitory Act. There, of course, was the beneficial, though perhaps poorly drawn-out proposals of Thomas Paine's common sense, or as some of the Tories called it, common nonsense. And in the most astonishing response to these actions and discussions of it, Congress actually began to do things. They began to do such things as, February 26th, an embargo was enacted on all exports.
What are we doing?
Which made it clear that there was a need for a second Continental Congress. The subject of independence came into greater contemplation for the following year, due to actions such as George III's declaration of all 13 colonies, not simply New England, being in open rebellion against England. There were the treacherous naval attacks due to Parliament's passage of the American Prohibitory Act. There, of course, was the beneficial, though perhaps poorly drawn-out proposals of Thomas Paine's common sense, or as some of the Tories called it, common nonsense. And in the most astonishing response to these actions and discussions of it, Congress actually began to do things. They began to do such things as, February 26th, an embargo was enacted on all exports to Britain. On March 2nd, Silas Deane was appointed a secret envoy to France to measure their potential support of our cause. March 14th, there was a resolution to disarm all Tories. And on March 23rd, a resolution to enable armed vessels to attack the enemies of the United Colonies, the beginnings of a navy. Of course, the thoughts were continuing to move towards independence, so much so that all colonies were recommended that they should create new government. The tide was turning toward independence when Richard Henry Lee brought forth the resolves from Virginia that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states. Though I believe that Mr. Lee laid that before you earlier. I personally recall 3 rather spirited days of debate. There were questions whether we, as a continent, were ready for independence. It was contemplated such by Mr. Dickinson, the not-so-humble farmer of Pennsylvania, James Wilson, and Edward Rutledge, and others. Some of our delegates from the differing colonies were without instruction on the question of independence itself. Well, this rather spirited discussion continued until cooler heads prevailed, and it was determined that the question should be delayed until Monday, July the 1st. In the meanwhile, it was approved, without objection, I might add, that a committee of 5 would be formed to create a declaration should this idea of independence take hold. Although I also believe that Mr. Jefferson laid that before you earlier. But after 2.5 long weeks, Mr. Jefferson had crafted a declaration. We had made minor suggestions to it. We laid it before the Congress, and on that Monday, the 1st day of July, after Congress had finished the other matters of the day, we were resolved into a committee of the whole. President Hancock left his chair, and Mr. Harrison filled it, so that the debates and the votes would not officially be recorded. And so we began the greatest and most solemn debate on the question of independence. Although, to be plain, frequent discussions had been had concerning it. At one time or another, all of the arguments for it and against it had been exhausted and were become familiar. I personally expected no more would be said in public, but that the question would be put and decided. But even as the swell of independence was rising, Mr. Dickinson, however, was determined to bear his testimony against it with more formality. He had prepared himself, apparently, with great labor and ardent zeal, and in a speech of great length, and with all his eloquence, he combined together all that had been before written in pamphlets and newspapers, and all that had been from time to time said in Congress, by himself and by others. He conducted the debate not only with great ingenuity and eloquence, but with equal politeness and candor. And I dare say that I hoped it was answered in the same spirit, because after waiting for some time in hopes that someone less obnoxious than myself would move, no member rose to answer him. Mr. Lee, who proposed the resolves, had returned to Virginia. I had seconded the motion in June, and I had to determine myself to speak. I began by saying that this was the first time in my life that I had ever wished for the talents and eloquence of the ancient orators of Greece and Rome, for I was very sure that none of them had ever before him a question of more importance to his country and to the world. They would probably, upon less occasions than this, have begun by solemn invocations to their divinities for assistance. But the question before me appeared so simple that I had confidence enough in the plain understanding and common sense that had been given me to believe that I could answer, to the satisfaction of the House, all of the arguments which had been produced, notwithstanding the abilities which had been displayed and the eloquence with which they had been enforced. The remainder of what I spoke was, I know not what. The truth is that no one, myself included, deemed my words compelling enough to write them down. It was likely a number of hackneyed responses to Mr. Dickinson's quotations, both of which had been heard many times before. But something happened in that room something that moved my fellow delegates from their seats. And it became clear that I had said what needed to be said. But before the final question could be put, the new delegates from New Jersey, Mr. Stockton, Dr. Witherspoon, and Mr. Hopkinson, all very respectable characters, entered into the chamber, having missed the arguments, and expressed a great desire to hear them. All was silence, and no one would speak, because all eyes were turned upon me. Well, Mr. Rutledge, Edward Rutledge, he came to me, and he was laughing, and he said, "Nobody will speak but you upon this subject. You already have all the topics so ready that you must satisfy the gentleman from New Jersey." I answered him, laughing just as much, that it had been so much the air of exhibiting like an actor or gladiator for the entertainment of the audience, that I was ashamed to repeat what I had said 20 times before. And I thought nothing new could be advanced by me. Well, the New Jersey gentlemen, however, were insistent upon hearing at least a recapitulation of the arguments. And as before, with no other gentleman being willing to speak, I summed up the reasons, objections, and answers in concise a manner as I could, till at length the New Jersey gentlemen said they were fully satisfied and ready for the question. But of course the official question would not be put forward today. No, that was to be held tomorrow, Tuesday, July the 2nd. In the meanwhile, an unofficial vote was taken, and the tally was 9 colonies to 4 in favor of independence. But that still left Pennsylvania and South Carolina opposed, Delaware divided, and New York either dead or asleep when it came to politics. I feared that all 13 clocks would never strike at once, and independence would forever elude us. But then the clocks began to align. South Carolina agreed to vote aye for the sake of unanimity. Pennsylvania's delegates were once blocked from voting for independence, but that had been removed, and some were choosing to vote for independence. And Thomas McKean rode through the night to bring an ailing Caesar Rodney, pale as death itself, back to Philadelphia to break the Delaware tie. And even with the New York delegates left without instruction or action, the vote the next morning was 12 colonies in favor of independence. There was a strange hush which fell over the crowd. And then, of course, well, the Congress got to the task of dismantling Mr. Jefferson's declaration. But I thought the more important occasion had passed. And I said so, actually, in a letter to my wife the following day, if you would permit me. This is a letter to my wife from July the 3rd, 1776. Had a declaration of independency been made months ago, it would have been attended with many great and glorious effects. We might before this hour have formed alliances with foreign states. We should have mastered Quebec and been in possession of Canada. But on the other hand, the delay of this declaration to this time has many great advantages attending it. The hopes of reconciliation, which were fondly entertained by multitudes of honest and well-meaning, though weak and mistaken people, have been gradually and at last totally extinguished. Time has been given for the whole people naturally to consider the great question of independence and to ripen their judgments, dissipate their fears, and allure their hopes by discussing it in newspapers and pamphlets, by debating it in assemblies, conventions, committees of safety and inspection, in town and county meetings, as well as in private conversations, so that the whole people in every colony of the 13 have now adopted it as their own act. This will cement the Union and avoid those heats and perhaps convulsions which might have been occasioned by such a declaration 6 months ago. But the day is past, The second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance with solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other from this time forward forevermore. You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will take. It will cost us to maintain this declaration and to support and defend these states. Yet through all the gloom, I can see rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth all the means, and that posterity will triumph in that day's transaction, even though we should rue it, which I trust in God we shall not. And my prediction proved correct, on everything except the date, of course. Instead, we began to celebrate 2 days later, on the date emblazoned upon the Declaration itself. But in truth, how many people pay that much attention to a declaration of Congress? It was certainly not expected to be as celebrated as the vote itself. But what we truly celebrate is a lasting independence. And for that I shall bear with my otherwise correct prediction. Now, I dare say, with the time that we have, I have been asked to look at some questions that you may have. So let me...
Any questions or comments? Have some back here.
Thank you very much, Richard. As usual, you illuminate with your background to these great events the things that people were saying and doing as human beings in this kind of a situation. It's just wonderful. I'm reminded a bit by Ellis's biography of John Adams, that he rode to Philadelphia with John Hancock, who he despised, and that he complained about him being, in effect, so elitist and so snooty and so demanding of special accommodations that he couldn't afford as a fellow traveler, which I guess maybe that helped to alert me to these were people with different views personally on great issues, and I think they're being able to get collective and come together was phenomenal. I have a question, however, as to when they were discussing being united as states to be free of Britain. I suspect, and maybe I'm wrong, that they were also looking beyond independence, what the states would be like. And I wondered whether they were conceiving themselves as sovereign states, as many of the states did after the Union was established, and right up to almost the present time, that each state was somehow sovereign. But the word sovereignty does not appear in any of the written declarations and later the Constitution. But I wondered whether there were any expressions of what they were going to see after independence in the way of their status as states.
I think they did see themselves as sovereign, and that continued for quite some time. The Articles of Confederation that were adopted after independence provided essentially that it was a union of states. It's interesting that through the Revolution, the United States of America, whenever that term was used, or just the United States, the United Colonies, took a plural verb. It's only some years after the Constitution that it becomes the United States of America is rather than are. And under the Articles of Confederation, the states could individually have negotiate and enact tariffs. They could put import duties. They could have treaties with Indians and so on. So they were actually very much sovereign states until after the Constitution. And that, for many people, that was what the Constitution was either for or they were against. So, yeah, very good.
Other comments or questions? I had a follow-up to Paul's. What's wonderful about this National Archives series is it shows personalities, and what it showed for John Adams was that he was self-deprecating and humble, but yet, very action-oriented. Often when scholars look at history, they look at it from the perspective of, what did people accomplish? What did they do together? But the issue of personality is hard for them to get at in terms of how it really affected history. Could you comment a bit on John Adams' role from that perspective?
Yeah, I'm not a John Adams expert by any means, but clearly, and I thought the actor did a very good job. Clearly, his strong personality, his commitment, he and his cousin Sam, very early with the organization of the Sons of Liberty, were committed to a break with Britain, and his personality was very strong in the Continental Congress, as I think we saw from that comment. He was in the years that he was the president at the end of the 18th century, he was charged with personal vanity. As you pointed out, he's very self-deprecating in his comments there. But he believed that long quote from the letter to Abigail, for example, he really believed that what we were doing here was of world importance. It wasn't just, well, we had a bunch of people, we adopted a resolution or two. No, we're changing the world. And he was very committed to that. So if he had a bit of vanity in later years, he was certainly entitled to it. And as you know, he lived on until 1826. And it was 50 years after the Declaration. And he had been, in between, he and Jefferson were not on speaking terms, but in these last years, the two of them got together and by mail and wrote wonderful letters about understanding what the whole American Revolution has been about. So, he's a very important figure, and there's been a lot of great biographies. There was several excellent television series that you can see the man. Yeah, we've got a question over here.
Mahini, is there any question online?
We've got a question over there.
Okay.
You're going to have to walk. comment.
In the previous discussions, the issue of slavery had come up, and some people had strong feelings of it, and others maybe not. What was the discussion of the issue of slavery in this document?
Well, this is giving away what's coming up next week, but no, that's all right. No, no, no. Let me tell you that Jefferson wrote into his draft of the Declaration a denunciation, a very long denunciation of the slave trade. Like Henry Lawrence and other people who had actually had a hand in it, they realized this is not a good thing. And he hoped that it would be forever extirpated. He did not believe in emancipation. And but let's stop this horrible slave trade. The result in the committee, when the committee of a whole was redefining and rewriting the Declaration, is that entire section was removed. It's not in the Declaration as we know it, because the delegates from Rhode Island and the delegates from South Carolina, both centers of the slave trade, said, oh, you can't attack our good merchants. They're true patriots. This is a wonderful trade. It's nothing wrong with it. So that whole thing was taken out. So in a sense, they took a stand against human slavery. Or the other way around, they took a stand against anything, even the baby steps toward abolition. No, no, no. But you did have individuals in there who had moved quite far on that, like Henry Lawrence of South Carolina.
Just one other comment about John Adams and the issue of religion, which is woven in this whole story in many ways with the Quakers and others. New England had very strong prejudices against Catholics, as I think their laws did not change about excluding Catholics for a period of time to vote, to go to Harvard, or to have many, many other benefits because of the history of England and the conflict between Catholics and Protestants. But when John Adams was going to the convention, or when he got to the convention, he'd been there 2 or 3 days, and he wrote to Abigail, you know, I've had to change my mind about some things. You know, I met this man from Maryland who was a Catholic, and we went out and went to the tavern and had some drinks. And you know, he's really a nice person, and I think I better rethink my position on Catholics. So he was a very flexible man, as well as open to other ideas and seeing things in a different light and a different perspective.
You know, as a matter of fact, he went to the Catholic Church in Philadelphia. It was served by Maryland Jesuits, and he attended the service and commented on it. He was very positive. So he was a man who had an open mind, and I wanted to just add one more thing. That this is about John Dickinson. John Dickinson was not a member of a Quaker meeting. His parents had left the Quaker meeting over the fact that their daughter had married out of meeting and was consequently criticized. So they said, no, our daughter married an Anglican, that's fine with us. Goodbye. He married a Quaker, and she was coming from a family that had actually had problems with the Friends meeting that they belonged to, requiring you to manumit your slaves. And they had a rather large plantation in Delaware. So in every sense, Dickinson was really, although he didn't belong to the Religious Society of Friends, in every sense, he really was a Quaker. And that was formed by them. And that was why he, to the very end, was so reluctant to do anything like that. So thank you all.
Let's thank Richard.
I appreciate it. Always good to see you. And next week, I guess we've got we're going to be looking at the document as Jefferson wrote it. And Pam has graciously run off copies of the English Declaration of Rights of 1689 and Jefferson's draft of the Declaration. So we're going to put you to work seeing how Jefferson's mind works and how it ends up in the Declaration. And then, as Adams told us, the committee didn't have very much to add. They changed a few words, but once it got into the Congress altogether, then they began to make major changes, like getting rid of anything talking about slavery. So we will hopefully see everybody next week. And thank you again.